Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And initially, Madam Speaker, when I wandered into the chamber today, I thought I had actually come into the wrong debate, because it says the House of Lords reform. And I don't believe, and I know my colleagues don't believe, there is no reforming something that is so deeply, deeply undemocratic and rotten to the core. And there is no doubt that the general public across the UK is disengaged from and deeply alienated by much of what goes on in this place. And it's dangerous for democracy when the very people it is intended to serve lose so much interest and faith in it. And we can come up with many warm words and grand ideas about how to tackle that. But I would argue that perhaps the single most important thing that we can do to repair some, not all, but some of that damage between those of us who serve and those whom we seek to serve would be to hear the calls, the deafening din in Scotland to abolish the House of Lords, which is no better than a carbuncle on the face of democracy across the United Kingdom. And there is a deep sense of frustration with it across communities in Scotland. And it's already been pointed out that this archaic, outdated, medieval and anachronistic in any state that purports to be a modern, enlightened and forward-looking democracy. And just to be clear, because it's come up a couple of times in the course of this debate so far, we do not just object to the personnel in the House of Lords. Although we do, but we do not recognise its legitimacy or its right to legislate over citizens of the UK. Of course.
Thank you for giving way, and I agree very much with what she's saying. The honourable gentleman on the other side suggested this never comes on the doorstep. Would she not agree that the reason for that is people are first concerned about jobs and housing and poverty and the health service? But if asked about the House of Lords, many people would say abolish it.
I absolutely agree with what the honourable gentleman has just said, and it's something that I'll touch on later in my speech. When people are talking to you on the doorstep, of course their priority is job security, food on the table, benefit sanctions. But if you scratch the surface, the House of Lords is universally hated across the UK, in my view. You will have some small pockets of support, some traditionalists, if you might want to call them that. But for the man and woman, ordinary man and woman in the street, this is an affront to modern democracy. It is bad enough that the House of Lords is unelected, but when you consider, and it's already been said by several other members so far, it's one of the disadvantages of being so far down the speaking list, but when you consider that only with the exception of Iran are we the only state in the world which has clerics pontificating on legislation, it really is quite incredible. And it shows, indeed, further the absurdity of this relic. Despite all the plaudits and feeble attempts, and I believe that they have been feeble, to justify the other place, perhaps by those who have pals or cronies who sit there, or by those who seek to retire there themselves when the voters reject them, it cannot be justified that those who are unelected, often those who have been actively rejected by voters, or perhaps, and arguably worse, those who have even shied away from presenting themselves to voters at any time at all, despite perhaps having political ambitions, it really is a laughingstock for the rest of the world.
I'm grateful to you for giving way just on that point. Does she share my disappointment that this government, when it had one MP from Scotland who became Scottish Secretary, in order to fill the role of Deputy Scottish Secretary, had to aggrandise someone, ennoble them, put them in the House of Lords in order to fulfil that role?
Indeed, I would very much wholeheartedly agree with what my honourable friend has said, and I would like to add my disappointment that the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the opposition in this House, who would consider himself having very left-wing credentials, has himself co-opted members of the House of Lords into his shadow cabinet. A travesty, if ever there was one. Now, in my formative years, I was a huge fan of the political novels of Anthony Trollope, but I have no wish to live in the 19th century.
Please hear that.
Signed up there. And if the Madam Speaker will indulge me for just a moment. I feel that I have to, because the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North has perhaps shamed me into doing so, and marital relations will become strained if I do not mention that the distinguished, certainly in my house, distinguished Member of Parliament for Cunningham, Member of the Scottish Parliament for Cunningham North, indeed unearthed figures showing that nearly 75% of the appointments to the Lords are defeated, retired or deselected MPs or former advisers. And it's true, because we hear it, we actually hear it. The stampede after every election, the stampede towards the ermine from this place to that place. Yeah. And if it were not so serious, Madam Speaker, I would be laughing. Hereditary peers, bishops, but only from the Church of England. And I've often wondered, does that mean that God's an Englishman?
Would my honourable friend give way? Would you agree that if God were a Scotsman, he still wouldn't want a place in the House of Lords?
Absolutely, absolutely. Cronies, party donors, party placemen and women, although there's fewer women than there are of placemen, failed politicians, retired politicians looking for a wee hobby. In 2016, maybe in Anthony Trollope's time, but for the love of God, Madam Chair, forgive me, come on, get a grip. And when we do get rid of this relic, I bet, just like the smoking ban, I bet we'll wonder, how did it take so long? Why did we wait so long? No one on these benches is saying that there are not some folk in the House of Lords who are well-intentioned. No one on these benches is saying that there are not some folk in the House of Lords who have much expertise and skill to offer their country's legislative process. It's quite hard to say, legislative process. No one is even saying that we should not enter into a debate about the relative merits of a second chamber to revise legislation. That's a debate we could and should have in the future. What we are saying is that anyone who seeks to pontificate over, revise, introduce or influence legislation in our Parliament should be elected by the people they purport to serve. It is as simple as that. And I'm almost embarrassed to repeat the numbers about China's National People's Congress, although I can't help but remember that I've made a comparison now with China and Iran. We are in good company with those beacons of democracy.
Honourable friend, give way. Thank you for giving way. Would you perhaps agree with the point that the late Right Honourable Member for Livingston made in his book, The Point of Departure, where he mentioned that he recalled an incident at the Europe-Africa Summit where a president of an African country said that while Britain had failed to get they could not be criticised for failing to introduce full democracy after only 50 years of independence, when Britain had failed to get rid of the hereditary principle after 500 years of Parliament.
Absolutely. Like I said, Madam Chair, we're becoming a laughingstock all over the world. In addition, and this is a very, very serious point, we are told that these are austere times. We cannot afford to have so-called benefit scroungers. We can only afford to help the so-called strivers. The House of Lords is full of them. we must punish families with more than 2 children, because everybody knows that if you have a third child, you're clearly at it trying to get money out of the taxpayer. Yet here we have, in the House of Lords, what my constituents, most of them would think of as a trough. It's costing £94.4 million, and this dripping roast, as my constituents would call it, costs more than the Scottish Parliament, an elected, accountable, forward-thinking, enlightened representative of the people. Even more members than the European Parliament. Now, Clement Attlee, in my view, has been very, very kind when he described the House of Lords as being like a glass of champagne that has stood for 5 days. I much prefer the analysis that says the best cure for admiring the House of Lords is to go and look at it. When we sanction vulnerable folk on benefits who are 5 minutes late for an appointment at the job centre, when we hammer women born in the 1950s by moving their retirement age further away, when we in Scotland, when my constituents see Scotland's budget being squeezed, and this is called a sustainable economic plan, I and so many others ask, how does this sustainable economic plan impact upon the waste, the affront to democracy, the dripping roast that is the House of Lords. And these people dare to pontificate over Scotland's constitutional future. And let's face it, the House of Lords themselves hardly take it seriously. Attendance is around 60%. You know, and the dripping roast is drying up. So perhaps the attendance has improved recently, and perhaps because much must be suckled in the last dying moments of the House of Lords. What a tragedy! What a tragedy that the 2015 Conservative manifesto indicated that it did not consider the House of Lords reform a priority. No, instead, let's prioritise bashing the vulnerable, taking benefits away from the poor. And the Strathclyde Review was a wasted opportunity. Then again, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Tinker at the edges all you like, you will never make this affront to democracy palatable enough for the people in my constituency to see it with any legitimacy. Let's abolish this carbuncle on the face of democracy. Let's listen to the people, and then they may begin listening to what this place has to say. I would urge the Minister to screw his courage to the sticking place. Get a grip, get rid. It's time the UK grew up.